Good day, good afternoon, everyone. We're just going to give folks a couple more seconds to log in, and then we'll get started. Good day, good afternoon. Thanks, everyone, for joining us for this afternoon's conversation hosted by the Institute for Security and Technology. Our conversation today is is intervention or cooperation, the roles for military and law enforcement in combating ransomware. IST, as I mentioned, is the host today. We're a West Coast-based think tank focused at the intersection of emerging technologies and security policy, making today's discussion on how governments can respond to ransomware a natural fit for this organization. My name is Megan Stiefel. I currently serve as the Chief Strategy Officer at IST and leading up the work, including in particular the efforts of the previously convened Ransomware Task Force. We have an amazing panel today, but before I turn to them, I do want to just kind of cover one what I assume to be an assumption, but wanted to make sure everyone else understands that it is an assumption. We're talking today about military and law enforcement capabilities to manage the ransomware threat, but I want to make sure that everyone understands that these are not the only tools in the government's toolbox, nor are they necessarily the priorities or given the highest level of priority because they're the topic of today's conversation. The use of these capabilities, however, is making headlines. And as our government matures its capability to manage strategic cybersecurity risk and the threat it poses to national security, we at IST believe a deliberate and transparent as possible and appropriate conversation about the tools we choose to use and when is important. So our discussion today is intended to aid that effort. I'm honored to have some great folks with me today. I think we were talking a minute ago that probably combined between us, there's somewhere between 75 years of experience managing not only cybersecurity risks and information operations and threats to ICTs, but also broader work, including Gary's work in military support to law enforcement activities. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our panelists quickly, and then we will turn to our conversation. I do want to note, too, that we will plan to save 10 minutes at the end, at least, for audience questions. Please use the Q&A feature to do so. So without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce Gary Korn, who is the program director at Tech Law and Security for the Tech Law and Security program at American University. He was previously an attorney for the US Army and served as a staff judge advocate at the United States Cyber Command. Lauren Zabrick is the executive director at Belfer Center's Cyber Project, which focuses at the intersection of cybersecurity and international conflict. She similarly previously served in government as an Air Force intelligence officer, as a civilian at NGA, the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, and then at Recorded Future. Dmitry Alperovich is currently the chairman of Silverado Policy Accelerator. Most folks know that Dmitry was co-founder and former CTO of CrowdStrike. He recently announced that the launch of the Alperovich Institute at for cybersecurity studies at the Johns Hopkins SICE program. Finally, Gavin Wild joins us from the Craig Stamos Group, where he is a managing consultant. He previously served as a director for Russia, Baltic, and Caucasus Affairs, excuse me, I'm having trouble this afternoon, at the NSC, the National Security Council, and prior to that at the Department of Defense. As I mentioned, we're going to save time for questions, so please do join in at the end of our conversation. So we're going to focus the discussion today around 3 or 4 core aspects of this issue. We're going to talk a bit about international law and norms. We're going to talk about domestic authorities and policy issues, including budgetary allocations and the role of the private sector, in particular in thinking about the private sector as a victim, a defender, a first responder, and in some cases in the blast zone. Before we get into all of that, though, I would like to turn first to Gary, in some ways to kind of set the stage domestically for us. What is it that we're talking about here? For you know, as I mentioned in the opening remarks, that several recent articles have described US Cyber Command undertaking activities abroad to counter ransomware actors. Can you describe at a high level the legal and policy framework for when these activities are considered? For example, does it matter where these actions are taking place, against which types of actors, criminal groups, nation states, and on what we refer to as which types of machines? Are we talking about third-party networks or networks owned and operated by these actors? Thanks, everyone. Gary, you're on mute.
I'm on mute. We all should learn that by now. Thanks for the opportunity to join you today and get off mute and join this conversation. Certainly an important one. At a very broad level, there's a domestic law and policy aspect to this. I will say up front that I think that this conversation is primarily one of policy and less of law, in the sense of the authority to actually be able to bring all elements of national power, to include the capability and capacity resident at Cyber Command, into this fight. And I'm glad you sort of pointed out up front, it doesn't necessarily mean that that is the primary effort, the focal point, right? It's a contributing piece. You've seen General Nakasone be very clear over a long period of time that his emphasis on partnerships, and I know he's been working those very hard since taking command, certainly during my time when we overlapped, and since. From a domestic law framework, we always say you have to have a trace from the operator all the way back to the president, and there has to be authority, emanating from the Constitution or federal law. Generally, the president has a fairly broad mandate and discretion when it comes to, obviously, national defense and foreign affairs. And we've seen a recognition and a sort of declaration recently of the national security threat aspect that ransomware has reached. It's not just sort of vanilla criminal activity by any shake of the stick, both because of the scale of what's happening, the increasing rate and severity, the target sets that the ransomware actors are going after, et cetera, and as well as the fact that we know the way this is structured, these actors are generally physically resident in areas that are beyond direct law enforcement reach. We've seen this before in other areas where then you have to look to what other bring there. You can't get in, but we know that each of the last at least 3 administrations have had a policy on the conduct of cyber operations. The current policy, NSPM 13, came into effect in 2018. I'll say as much as I've seen the DoD General Counsel say that it did involve a change in a framework that allowed for further delegation to the department and down to Cyber Command for certain activities, but certainly still well-coordinated activities across the interagency. I have to assume, I'm not there now, I wasn't involved in these reported operations, but that there was direction, there's mission direction that flows down to bring Cyber Command into this piece of the fight, okay? And then we look to see if there are any domestic statutes that would put guardrails or restrictions or prohibit these activities. And, frankly, I don't see anything jumping at me. And there's the tradition of the Posse Comitatus Act, but for reasons we could dive into, the Posse Comitatus Act is not really a barrier to this type of activity. Certainly, and to part of your question, again, there's a strong presumption in my mind that these are operations where the effects are being generated outside of the United States, right? The Posse Comitatus Act is really something that restricts the use of the military and domestic law enforcement scenarios. And just to some of your other questions, and Dimitri's probably a much better person to ask on this, but we know that the way actors operate in cyber is not, so maybe these operations are impacting their direct infrastructure, devices they control, but generally infrastructure is spread out across various states, whether it's a botnet or what have you, whether you're using co-opted or contracted virtual private servers, et cetera. I don't have the infrastructure laid down that Revel is using, but my guess is there's a good chance that maybe some of the disruptive effects, and we don't know exactly what those were, might be touching infrastructure in third-party states. And so then there's a second aspect of this, that what does international law have to say about these activities? That is, a very sort of open and in some ways hotly debated question when you're talking about activities that do not cross the threshold of a use of force. So we're not talking about activities in armed conflict. We're not talking about anything that I've seen reported that would come anywhere close to a cyber operation or effect that amounts to a use of force. And all indications to this point are that the United States is not certainly hasn't endorsed a view that there's a general rule of sovereignty that would prohibit cyber operations that involve engaging with infrastructure in third-party states. Certainly at a certain threshold level. Even states that have come online now and taken a position quite distinct from the position that the United Kingdom has taken publicly about whether sovereignty stands as a legal bar to certain activities. They acknowledge that there is at least a de minimis rule in effect, right? It is not all cyber operations with some effect that would cross that legal barrier. So there's maneuver space here, unquestionably, that Cyber Command under the right direction can operate in to have some disruptive effect, especially when you're talking about temporary reversible kind of activities. I think Dimitri gave a great laydown in a lawfare piece that talked about, at least what some of this looked like, and we can get into that.
Sure. So broadly speaking, these types of activities that Cyber Command may be taking, it sounds as though you're describing as what some folks would characterize as traditional military activities.
Well, we got to be careful here. Traditional military activities has a very specific legal meaning in the U.S. Code, and that is, generally you're going to operate. This goes to sort of the transparency question. Transparency about what? Transparency about our actual operational activities. That's not going to be very effective. No. We know that, right? So maybe the overall architecture and the decisions to use different departments and agencies and how we're going to use them, that's fair. But when you're operating in a secretive manner, let's say, without getting into the head of the pin discussions of covert versus clandestine, you potentially run into the covert action statute, which is an oversight limitation, and traditional military activities are considered an exception to that, which Congress also spoke to a couple of years ago and provided some clarity on that point. So, yeah. So
thanks, Gary, for the background. You talked a little bit about activities that are outside the scope of one particular nation's ability to address them, that are outside the scope potentially of law enforcement activity. I wanted to turn to, in particular, Gavin and Dimitri and Lauren to see if there was anything else they wanted to add to sort of the foundational here. What types of activities are we talking about? We also talked a little bit about, I think, Gary, but not in great detail, who these actors are. Are they nation state actors? Are they criminal groups? And does that matter when we consider which tool we're going to take out of the toolbox? Does it matter what the types of targets that they're hitting, right? If they're, we've been staring down kind of the barrel of losses in business email compromise, but we're not necessarily always saying that we need to pull the military tool out of the toolbox to manage that risk. So here we're trying to kind of give folks what are the boundaries here? What are the guideposts and what's in the box here? What are the four corners of the box that we're talking about, where our audience can understand, right, this type of actor had an impact on this type of target, and does that matter when we decide how we might respond, or whether or not we have indications and warning that the type of actor may be targeting critical infrastructure or not, and therefore does that matter in thinking about what types of activities and who in the United States government's arsenal, if you will be the first, and we know it's not just one, right? It's a whole of government effort here, and thinking about managing this risk. So Gavin, I guess I'll turn to you first.
Yeah, I think I would just take issue with the assumption that because that these guys are automatically out of the reach of law enforcement, in most cases, because in the past few weeks we've seen that although it does take time and coordination, there's some that certainly are within reach of U.S. law enforcement. And, secondarily, just because they are outside the reach of U.S. law enforcement does not automatically equate to they are within the technical reach of U.S. Cyber Command, whether by dint of Cyber Command's own capabilities or by dint of the fact that, as you pointed out at the outset, these ransomware actors are utilizing infrastructure that spans across boundaries, that spans across authorities, et cetera. So I think there's a couple of baked in assumptions that we need to interrogate a little bit more robustly when we talk about whether or not the military instrument is the optimal one to use for countering ransomware.
I know Dimitri has thoughts, but before we get to Dimitri, I might give Lauren a chance to weigh in as well.
Thanks, Megan. Yeah, when we're thinking about, that box, as you said, so, Dr. Erica Lonergan, formerly Borgard, and we penned an article earlier in the fall, and we said that there's this compelling case to be made for the use of military force against ransomware that meets a few conditions, right? So activities that have significant national security consequences linked to broader strategic campaigns, but that emanate outside of US borders, right? So we think that there's a threshold there for the use, because otherwise, most of this cybercrime really falls outside the purview of the US military. And then elsewhere in this article, and we can get into this later, and I'd love to give Dimitri the chance to jump in on this too. We talk about what are some of the really important questions that policymakers should be asking about the use of military force.
Yes, thanks, Lauren, for clarifying there. Dimitri, I know you have a lot to say on this, but in the first opening remarks.
So let me say a couple of things. So one, as everyone on this call knows, ransomware has become a critical national security problem today. I would argue one of the most difficult ones, as we've seen the most vulnerable institutions across our country and across the countries of our allies are being impacted by this. I'm talking about schools, I'm talking about hospitals, I'm talking about fire stations, police departments, exactly the type of organizations that are actually least prepared to defend themselves, don't have the resources, don't have the people, and let's be honest, they never will. So how do we defend ourselves against this? Well, as I've penned with my colleague from the Wilson Center, Matthew Rojansky, a couple of op-eds in the Washington Post earlier this summer, the true way to deal with this is ultimately to deal with the safe havens, the primary one of which, although not the only one, but the primary one is Russia, where many of the kingpins of these organizations are residing. So we have argued over the course of a couple of op-eds that there's a unique opportunity for President Biden to pressure Russia to deal with these issues and putting severe sanctions, not unlike, frankly, the sanctions that we're discussing right now in the context of the Ukraine invasion, to defend America. It's interesting to me that we're talking about sanctions about defending Ukraine, with which we do not have a treaty obligation to defend. There's no mutual defense treaty with Ukraine. But we're not willing to use those sanctions, or have not been willing to use those sanctions up to this point, to defend the citizens of the United States of America. Some of them are impacted in the most severe way from these ransomware attacks, not just in the financial sense, not just in the inconvenience sense of having to wait around for hours on end, waiting for gas when the Colonial Pipeline goes down, but as we've seen in over the last couple of months, articles about hospitals being targeted, and even potentially a case where a newborn baby in Alabama tragically died potentially as a result of a ransomware attack on that hospital, shutting down the nursing station monitors and ultimately leading to a birth where the umbilical cord was wrapped around the baby's neck and it tragically suffocated. So those are the types of things that are happening on a daily basis. And in the absence of getting serious on Russia, which we have not done, and should Russia invade Ukraine, as I think is increasingly likely in the coming months, any prospect of getting their help on ransomware just disappears into the ether completely, because clearly the relations will hit yet a new low point beyond which it would be very, very difficult to recover. So in the absence of that, what can we do? And as I've argued in another op-ed in the New York Times that I posted in the chat, I think one of the few options we have is to use our cyber command and the intelligence community capabilities to disrupt those groups. Yes, we should be doing law enforcement. It's not an either or. Yes, we should be cracking down on cryptocurrencies, which is another critical component that's fueling this ransomware ecosystem by enforcing KYC and AML regulations across global cryptocurrency exchanges. But ultimately, that's not enough. Ultimately, we need to scale down the volume of this activity, which is increasing by the day. And by the way, in the face of the LogJ vulnerability that was discovered last week, I'm fully expecting to see some major ransomware attacks leveraging that vulnerability in the coming, literally probably hours. We already know that there are initial access brokers that work with many of these ransomware groups who have been using the LogJ vulnerability to compromise networks. It's only a matter of time before they resell that access to ransomware groups, and we're going to start to see some devastating attacks. So in the face of that, we should be doing three things. We should be targeting people, we should be targeting money, and we should be targeting infrastructure through both cyber and non-cyber means. With cyber, I'm talking about ability to penetrate networks of those organizations, identify those individuals. Yes, try to arrest them when we can, when they travel outside their safe havens, because certainly they won't get arrested in Russia, they won't get prosecuted there. That's become pretty clear. But as Gavin pointed out, sometimes they do travel overseas, although it's becoming more and more rare as they've seen enough cases where those arrests take place. But when it does happen, we should take advantage of those opportunities. When it doesn't happen, we should dox them. I think we should make their lives increasingly difficult. We should publicize them. We should make sure that they know that there's no place to hide and their lives and reputations will be ruined forever if they engage in this activity. More importantly, we should be going after their money. And we've done this in a few cases. In the case of Colonial, in the case of Kaseya, the US government has been able to return some of the cryptocurrency that was paid in those ransoms by a variety of different means, utilizing the capabilities of the full capabilities of the US government. We should be doing much more of that. We should be hacking into their wallets. We should be transferring cryptocurrency funds out of those wallets, cloning those wallets, etc. There's a range of tools that we have at our disposal to do so. And finally, we should be taking down the infrastructure. Now, the last piece is actually, I think, the least important because that will have temporary effects. You take down a server, they'll stand up another one. But nevertheless, if you do it in a strategic way, in a coordinated way, you can impact their operations, you can slow them down, reduce the amount of attacks that they can launch. And all of that is just absolute goodness. And we should be doing all of it in conjunction with law enforcement, in conjunction with treasury actions against cryptocurrency, because we need to use the full toolkit of our power to protect Americans. At this point, there is no other option, and it's inexcusable for us not to do so. This is the virtual equivalent, in my view, of terrorism. We use our military to go after terrorist groups. We should be using our military, cyber command in this particular case, to go after ransomware criminals. I can't believe that this is even up for debate. Thank you.
Well, that was a fulsome response. And I see Gary has his hand up, but I am going to come to you after I turn to Gavin, because I think there's a good, I don't want to call it a tension, but I think there's certainly a difference of opinion between what Dimitri shared in his remarks, as well as some of the writings that he has shared, not all of which we added to the reading list, but we can and will add to the reading list that we created for this conversation. One of the pieces on the reading list is a piece in Just Security that Gavin penned, and I think it was last week or the week before. So Gavin, I want to give you the opportunity, and I think there are a few things that from my experience, I have questions about, but as the moderator, I will attempt to be the neutral party here. But one of the things that I think I would like for us to, if we can, pick apart a bit is to say, right, so we want to go after wallets. Who should be doing that activity? How much should we work to coordinate internationally within the financial institution community? And how much should we just sort of beg for, act first and beg for forgiveness after? I think the analogy to terrorism, I shouldn't say analogy. certainly agree there are tremendous lessons to be learned in the case of terrorism. I think although it took an even larger so far national tragedy, though Dimitri alluded to several concerning events, to get us in a place as a government to bring this all tools approach and really kind of put down our weapons internally and bring everything we can to the table, and build a real common operating picture that brought all of these resources and enabled us to pool information in a way that was both protective of privacy and civil liberties, but also leveraged not only military authority against terrorists, but also law enforcement. So first responses, and then I know we'll come to Gary.
So I think there's a couple of assumptions I want to poke at. First of all, I think when people say we need to use every tool in the toolkit, that there's a baked-in assumption there that the plural of tactic is strategy, and that's just simply not the case. There's a smart, effective way to do this that does not risk essentially pulling very sophisticated capabilities off of a very, very complicated and at sometimes existential beat in the U.S. Foreign and security realm to do what is essentially a function that's better suited under law enforcement capabilities. And secondly, like the assumption that nation state actors are using ransomware as a springboard to target U.S. critical infrastructure, and our response is to use CyberCom to demonstrate somehow not that we can hold that same state's critical infrastructure at risk, but that we can hold the ransomware actors at risk. That mismatch seems kind of acute to me in the kinds of signaling that we want to send to our adversaries. And so, and we've been down this rodeo before where the United States has adopted a foreign and security policy that over-militarizes transnational threats, whether it be counter-narcotics, whether it be counterinsurgency, that ultimately have proven less accountable, less effective, and ultimately less strategically viable than originally conceived, all while the other elements of our statecraft were relegated to supporting roles or left to atrophy altogether. And I think that's in particular the case with our law enforcement apparatus in the 30+ year history of the cyber discipline within the United States government. And so I think it centers around priorities, precedence, and performance. And those are three key areas where I think we have to answer what it does, what we're doing budgetarily, what kind of person, power, and resources are applied where, what this will mean for civil military relations and international norms, what the prospects are for our own strategic distraction, particularly where Cyber Command, as Lauren and Erica have written, has a massive remit, an existentially important remit that risks getting sidelined where it already lacks sufficient resources to perform. And so my argument is not necessarily one of offense versus defense, but of strategically impactful versus tactically satisfying.
So you do not think, Gavin, can I just ask Gavin a follow-up question? You do not think that stealing money from ransomware groups, identifying individuals, doxing their identities, shutting down their networks and servers, potentially putting bugs in their code where the encryption algorithms have weaknesses, you don't think that will have an impact on those groups?
I absolutely do think it would have an impact on those groups. My worry is that it would have, depending on who does it, it would have a very deleterious impact on the department or agency tasked with doing so. And so the opportunity cost, for instance, we have traffic problems in DC. Pulling FBI agents off of their beats to go and write traffic tickets, that kind of seems like the analogy that there are better, more effective, and more appropriate tools in our toolkit relative to the other threats and the other tasks that Cyber Command is charged with performing.
Like what? I mean, this is what we have Cyber Command for, to protect the nation, to defend our citizens against foreign threat actors. The primary foreign threat actors impacting the lives of Americans today are not necessarily nation states, although they impact our economy through economic espionage and so forth. They're ransomware groups. That should be the top priority for Cyber Command.
if we can tease out where that ranks on their priority between securing nuclear C3 and chasing down ransomware actors, that's exactly the type of accountability that I would be seeking.
I know we'll come to Gary, and then I have some questions that I want to bring Lauren back in here.
Yeah,
certainly her article touched on some of this as well.
A lot to unpack. First, as a sort of minor point, if you look at, first of all, it's great that we've seen some successes recently in being able to get actual, custody over some of these bad actors and maybe bring them inside of a U.S. courtroom. Those are wins. Those are successes. But if you look at the numbers, just overall, in the number of foreign cyber threat actors that we've been able to actually get our hands on and bring them into U.S. courts, compared to the level of activity that's out there and engaged in, it's infinitesimal. So we can't say that law enforcement is in a position to do what law enforcement would do primarily here. I mean, they've used some of unique authorities as of late as well to have disruptive effect against infrastructure. Again, that's a win, but it's a piece of a much bigger pie that needs to be addressed, to Dimitri's points, and I agree with him. It's also very much a presumption that the leadership of the DoD and Cyber Command just don't understand their priorities and where they can afford to apply resources against various problems. They think this through very carefully. It's not an either or. And the other point too is, we say more appropriate, again, to Dimitri's point about terrorism. Before 9/11, terrorism was viewed as a law enforcement issue. That didn't mean that it didn't have a national security nexus to it. It didn't mean that DoD wasn't engaged and involved in an all hands approach. We saw, unfortunately, that maybe the balancing within DIME wasn't optimal. And we had to change posture when we saw exactly what type of threat these non-state actors posed. And just the last point, we can move on, Megan, but to your earlier question, it's great if they're saying, here are the thresholds we should have, right? These are the circumstances. But that presumes also some really deep insights, right, into connectivity between a ransomware group and a nation state. There are times where there's that connectivity, but the threat still exists, right? And so being postured to be disruptive of this, to counter these activities, when you see that they present a national security threat, shouldn't turn solely on whether you can make a connection to a nation state or not. And just sorry, my true last point. There's a difference in my mind between actions that are aimed at disrupting, especially the infrastructure, counter cyber activities, and the notions of imposing cost, right? And so this isn't necessarily just about going after a ransomware group to impose cost on a nation state that we think may be behind it. It's about basic disruption, like we do in counterintelligence, like we do in counterterrorism operations, but within the environment of cyberspace.
Okay. So I think everyone now recognizes that we, in theory, have a balanced scale here, and I'm doing my level best to stay in the middle. So I want to come in and turn over to Lauren, who, as she mentioned, has also written on this. And I think there are some questions that we've talked about that, were we to have a much longer time, I mean, I think I'll talk for hours about this, and I hope someday we do get to. Some of these other pieces of this, right? So sure, we have this tool, but I think Gavin mentioned a particularly important one, which is this idea of precedent. And I think about, although Dimitri is less, thinking about what precedent does this set, and particularly drawing upon Dimitri, as he was in the private sector before most of us were, his, thinking about how to protect customers in the face of these types of actions that are being undertaken by US Cyber Command. So there's also this question of kind of trade-off. If we know, the US Cyber Command is going to take care of the little guy, is the little guy going to spend any money on cybersecurity? Dimitri raises the point that they're never going to be prepared anyways. And I think I did have the opportunity on my ride last night to read Dimitri's piece in Foreign Affairs, I think it was, about incentives. So maybe at the very end, we can come back to incentives to try and solve this. But first, I want to come to Lauren to flesh out some of her thoughts.
Okay, so lots of thoughts here. I first also wanted to sort of take a step back and say that having been in the military and then, as a civilian, as you mentioned, but a large part of my career was spent in that, CT, war on terror sort of construct. I did make an earlier comparison to, these actors kind of being like cyber terrorists, right? So I had made that argument on Twitter back in July, because, right, they're attacking, these systems and, our way of life, our well-being, our viability and things like that. And so, I think there's a real, again, that compelling argument, for the military to protect us in certain circumstances. But there's some questions here, and the things that we sort of outlined in the piece, there's sort of this broad bucket here on, get rid of that poll, strategic, how military force is employed, right? So how it's going to deconflict and even complement efforts across government. So within a whole of government situation, a whole of nation situation, what's the process for doing so? As we know, these operations are so different from what we're used to. Now, if we're looking at, say, a terrorist event, right, it's very acute. It's sort of a point in time thing. It's supposed to be very spectacular. Cyber operations are much different than that, right? So the scale, the reach, the stealth, the ongoing danger, right? Especially if they're holding targets at risk. And so, that sort of strategic thing. And I also want to bring up this concept of transparency. So, we're finding out several months later that the CyberCom has, operated against ransomware actors. And, the difference with law enforcement too is that, in a law enforcement led operation, it's a lot more transparent. And I think the public really benefits from those disclosures, right? So like when we know what happened, we know, the actors involved and what what was done to, mitigate that, respond to it, et cetera. And then there's sort of this operational bucket too. So looking at, again, prioritizing missions over, others, because we know they have, a bunch of different missions. How to ensure tactical and strategic success. So we, talking about the war on terror and CT operations, I think we're very successful tactically, right? But did that, kind of lead to an overall, strategic success? I think, we could debate that for a long time. And so we just sort of warn, let's kind of think about this. What is the best way to do that? Can we come up with this sort of overall strategy and orient our, as Gavin said, already strained resources to do so? And then there's some, the question of, setting that precedent. So as we know, there are some nations who are very concerned about the militarization of cyberspace. And I think you can say, well, that's ironic, right? But, I think there has to be some discussion there. And then finally, from that resource perspective, the personnel perspective, even General Nakasone has said, we do not have enough resources to allocate towards all the different missions. And, they're supposed to do this review and provide that to Congress. So when are they going to get, more resources? And, again, sort of taking lessons from, the previous 20 years, looking at the force and making sure that they're taken care of and making sure that, their family members and things like that are okay. Burnout, et cetera, et cetera. So there's just a lot of questions to sort of work through, and we haven't done that yet. And so, that's kind of the line we're walking here. There's that really compelling case, and there's obviously, a huge need to impose costs and protect our nation. We just are kind of warning, say, let's do this right.
Thanks, Lauren. So I hope folks had a chance to respond to the poll, just so everybody knows that was all Dimitri's idea. But we told him he couldn't use his bot army to tip the scales. So, but I want to press further on this because I think the question was a bit of an easy one. I think the bigger question really is not should we use them. I would think, but I don't want to speak for Gavin or Lauren. I think there are circumstances certainly where that should always be the case, that it's always an option. But there's this issue of restraint and this question of precedent. And I think it's actually quite timely that we're having this discussion this week because of the conversations underway in New York right now. Our I think leading diplomat on this space is actually up there this morning. I think I saw her tweet that she's up at the UN. So what does this do for us if, assuming that we continue to use Cyber Command in this space where I don't think we've yet decided whether or not we certainly see attacks on unprotected entities. We've seen attacks schools. Now, you can argue about whether or not how large of a question that is around critical infrastructure. We've certainly seen attacks on critical infrastructure. I think there's not even a question anymore about whether that was intentional or it was an accident. But if we continue to follow down this road, what precedent do we sit? And are we at risk of, the analogy that I used to use was, well, are we sitting in a glass house? What in the homeland are we putting at risk by, if anything, and Dimitri's already shaking his head, but I'm not going to let him go first, by thinking about these authorities as, it sounds like, this idea that perhaps it is sort of at the top of the list. I might turn to Gavin first, but I don't want to be unfair.
I'll jump in and just say if Jay Healy had a great article where he outlined the budgetary numbers. When Dimitri talks about how a lot of these entities won't have the capacity to do anything about ransomware. If you look at the budget numbers, we really haven't even tried. Most of the authorities and the budgetary allocations to do something about this have gone to one entity, and that's DoD. And so I'm absolutely in the camp of, yes, it's a tool in our toolkit. Yes, they should, under certain circumstances, be an option. My contention is we really have kind of painted ourselves into the corner, both budgetarily, resource-wise, and authorities-wise, to where we haven't even given ourselves any other option. And my assertion is that, Dimitri rightly points out, we don't have a cyber problem, we have a geopolitics problem. My addendum to that is we don't have a ransomware problem, we have a cybercrime capacity problem.
So what about this cybercrime? Go ahead, Dimitri, and then I know I can't not let you respond. So
look, we're not going to defend ourselves out of this problem. And by the way, the US government spends more on cyber defense than probably all of the private sector in this country combined. So let's not talk about how we are not spending enough money. We're wasting so much money and we're not getting much back for it. I'm fully on board with that view, but I'm not of the view that we should be wasting even more money on things that don't produce a whole lot of benefit. And the reality is that in this environment, offense always wins, and particularly against organizations that are small, that don't have the staff, that never will have the staff because we don't even have enough people to hire to fill every school district, every municipality, every water utility, you name it, across this country. And it's going to take us decades to get there if we ever will. So let's not kid ourselves that we don't need offense. We absolutely need offense. And by the way, if we're going to have offense, if we're going to have Cyber Command, this is what they should be doing. I can't think of anything else that is more important. And by the way, nuclear C3 issues is not Cyber Command's responsibility. It's actually NSA's authority. So we're not taking anything away from Cyber Command to help protect that, which is an important mission. I agree with you, as are the rest of our weapon systems, also under NSA's responsibility. But what Cyber Command should be doing, it has dedicated offensive units. I can't think of a higher priority thing that they should be doing with those offensive units right now than going after ransomware. They can put on pause their plans to use cyber in conjunction with kinetic campaign to bomb Iran or whatever else they may be planning out there, and they can handle ransomware for the next 6 months. Let
me just jump on that too, if I can, Megan. There's also a question from resourcing of duplication of resources, because that is the capability and capacity that is the sort of central point of Cyber Command, is within the 133 teams, the cyber mission teams, the ability to engage in out-of-network operations that can have disruptive effect. So that is not something that is a law enforcement sort of tool or activity. Are we going to start replicating that in other departments and agencies when this is a capability capacity that is just as valuable and easily used for what you would, I think some of this group would call the more traditional national defense areas, looking at nation state threats and so on. The infrastructure that's out there and being used, there's levels of sophistication, but it's all essentially the basic same stuff. And so whether it's a ransomware actor or a nation state actor, the ability to have access to, insights about, and the opportunities, which are often fleeting, to have disruptive effect. Why would we replicate that elsewhere within the government and duplicate the costs to maintain that capability and capacity?
I'm interested to hear others' feedback, but I think there's I don't want to say that's missing the point, but I don't think that's the argument being asserted. Instead, no one's suggesting that the FBI should have authority to hack crypto wallets in Moscow. I think instead what we're talking about is, rather than pursuing offensive cyber operations, thinking about using mutual legal assistance, the 24/7 network of in the law enforcement community to enable the exchange of information, the freezing of assets, and the like, as as the cash out is happening. So I think there's also a question, and it was Vanessa in the Q&A posed around, which we'll take under advisement and maybe think about having a future conversation around. But we also can, I think, forget and this was also the case in the terrorism space, the ability for law enforcement authorities to help inform and build out the common operating picture. So we only have about 10 minutes left, and I want to use that as a probably inelegant pivot to say, what do we do about where we are in Congress? We continue to give money to Cyber Command. Dimitri makes the point that we use a lot of money to protect networks defensively as well. And yet, we know that there's a huge ransomware problem, and we know that we have a serious information gap. We know that the losses that we have from ransomware actually probably vastly are larger than what is reported. But last week we couldn't even get information, reporting requirement through Congress. How are we going to be able to best decide which authority to use if we can't even build a good picture? And so we're kind of left with a limited, I would argue, aperture through which to see how we can, who's after us, and then think about more holistically which of these tools we should use. So anybody want to take a swing at Congress? I know it's kind of a happy thing to do here because I actually am in DC today. But so what do we do about this question of fine, we want to use, some would argue, let's go for Cyber Command. I think that might be easy with less information, but if we had more information, would that help us?
I think so. I think we have to keep pushing. Even though it didn't make, this legislation this time around, I think we have to keep pushing. I think, most people agree that it's extremely important. You made the point, Clara Jordan made the point, another time, if you can't measure the problem, right, how are you going to craft the appropriate policy solutions to do that? So it may be dead for now, but I think we got to keep pushing for it.
I think I would agree, and I think the NDA process is emblematic of the entire the problem I'm highlighting. That the only way to get the types of reinforcements we're talking about is to ride on a defense allocation bill. What does that tell us about how serious we're taking reinforcing the other elements of our statecraft to tackle this?
Well, but we've seen a fair amount of legislation implemented from the Solarium Commission's recommendations through NDAAs, a significant buildup in CISA. These are all good things. Yeah, I mean, the NDAA is the mechanism, mostly because the NDAA is about the one piece of legislation we can almost guarantee will get passed each year. And so it does become the Christmas tree that everyone tries to hang some bulbs on. We understand that. But, you know, and I'm sorry, Megan, I think it's not entirely missing the point when I brought up before, because we're having this conversation as if it's a zero-sum game. And if it's a dichotomy and an either or. So there's, you know, putting more resources into law enforcement capability to be more effective in this space, all for it, right? I mean, but the funding of Cyber Command is not a funding that is directed at dealing with ransomware. It's a funding that's directed at dealing with national defense and the threats that cyber presents overall. Then there's an internal question about prioritization. That's a fair question. How that fits into a broader strategy, no doubt. But it's not as if somebody's fighting for, well, take it away from Cyber Command and now give it over to law enforcement. And it's a unique slice of the things that we would engage in for disruption. It's not the gamut. We're not sending Cyber Command teams out to arrest people under MLATs or otherwise. So it is an argument in some level to duplicate resources if we start pulling away from this.
Dimitri, thoughts on the information sharing?
I just want to come back to the point. I just want to come back and in an attempt to bring some consensus to this discussion. I want to agree with Lauren that to the extent that we're doing cyber operations against ransomware groups, and I'm obviously, in case it's not very clear to the audience, wholeheartedly in favor of them. I do think that we absolutely should be talking about them. It's almost counterproductive to not do so. I understand if you're doing some covert act against a nation state, you don't want to discuss it publicly, you don't want to escalate the situation. None of those things apply. If cyber deterrence is a thing, and it's questionable that it is, but if you can deter anyone in cyberspace, it is precisely those ransomware groups. And letting them know that the full power of the US military in cyberspace is coming after them can have a significant deterrent effect on individuals that do not want to face the prospects of that outcome. And it's not like when we do these operations, i.e. steal their money, shut down their infrastructure, dox their people, that they don't know that it's happening to them. It's not that if we would take credit for it, it would be escalatory, because they're already hitting every critical infrastructure that we have in this country. What else are they going to do to us beyond that? So we should be taking credit for it. We should be proud of it. And we should be doing it every single day and twice on Sunday.
I know Gavin wants to respond, so I'm going to give Gavin a chance to respond, and then I'm going to ask everyone for their 30-second or shorter wrap up, because we're not getting questions from the audience, but I don't know that we're actually going to have time for them. So if you have a burning question in the audience, please put it in the Q&A. Otherwise, Gavin, over to you, and then we'll go ladies first through our closing comments.
I would just reiterate the point that the signal that risks being sent if we do what Dimitri proposes is that we tell Beijing and Moscow that some edgelords in Moscow or some trolls in St. Petersburg can occupy the attention span and the resources of the premier offensive cyber capability in the United States government. Whether or not that's a wise signal to send, I'll leave to the audience.
By the way, Gavin, Ellen Nakashima from the Washington Post is already sending that signal with her exposés.
So there's actually a question that I want to make sure we have time for, or try to get somebody to address. And I know everyone knows, or not, excuse me. So everyone knows Dimitri does have to run at the top of the hour, but if we run over, maybe the others can stay. So there's a question from an anonymous attendee that I will interpret as a Hill staffer because of the following question. What should Congress do to proactively address the ransomware threat that is not DoD Cyber Command centric? So I will kick it over, I think, probably to Lauren or Gavin first, and then come to our other panelists.
Well, I think it's an interesting question, and I was thinking about this earlier, and we've had this conversation throughout the panel too. Who has the most resources? Should law enforcement have more resources to be able to do more disruptive operations on a larger scale? I don't know. I think there has to be more resources in general. I think, certainly the reporting requirement, data, I'm going to put it out there, national data privacy, national, data security, breach notification, all this stuff to sort of, raise that collective level of security, hopefully. There has to be sort of a, multi-layered approach here. I'll say that.
If I can just jump in, and I have to run, unfortunately, but just real quick. So the first thing the person asking the question should do is reach out to Silverado Policy Accelerator. We have a range of proposals in this space that we'd be happy to share, but I'll give you one in the interest of time. And that is, I think Congress can do more to authorize the Treasury Department to impose sanctions on cryptocurrency exchanges globally that are not engaging in AML and KYC approaches on transactions. They're going through those exchanges and that are not collaborating with law enforcement. Right now, I think the bar for sanctioning them is too high, and doing something like that would have an immediate effect at cleaning up the cryptocurrency ecosystem from nefarious transactions that are going through these exchanges. So with that, unfortunately, I have to bow out, but thanks so much for the discussion. Very enjoyable.
Thanks, Dimitri, for joining us.
Okay. I'll take a swing at it. I mean, we obviously have a significant information gap with respect to activities that happen within or on infrastructure domestically. That's the information sharing piece. We've been talking about this for quite some time. We've made some progress, I suppose, but there are all sorts of obstacles to effective information sharing. And I think we should continue to look at how we can reduce those obstacles, whether it's, reduction in liability, risk, et cetera, to stimulate better information sharing, the reporting requirements that were mentioned, et cetera. That is going to be, a key piece. Whether law, I can't speak for DOJ, obviously, how much resourcing, I would agree with the piece on sanctions, et cetera, but the resourcing of DOJ, they still have to operate within the confines of legal process in order to take the disruptive actions that they take, which is a kind of a bit more of a constraint case. Whether more resourcing and would build out capacity to do that more effectively, if that's possible, then have at it. Yeah.
Well, I will resist the urge to wade into the liability and whether enough there is already enough liability protection out there. But maybe we can come back to that in a future conversation too. And we'll try and have some of our less. We'll try and bring some of the private sector lawyers to the conversation if they're willing to come. So I think we're at last minute kind of closing remarks. I know I think Alan posed a question and Lauren responded, and I think that's a great idea of this idea of a year of service. There is an element of that I think that exists, but it's certainly worth I think considering and deepening and enhancing that ability. We know there's, as I think many know, a shortage of qualified staff, folks available to fill the many positions open in cybersecurity, and giving folks an opportunity to see what it's like might be one way to do so. So I want to say thank you to our panelists before I give them the opportunity to say their closing remarks. And I will first, I think, give it to Gavin.
Yeah, I'm thanks to everybody. It was an honor to take part in the discussion. I would say the main takeaway, at least from my perspective, is to put the ransomware issue in broader foreign and national security strategy perspective, and work from there to identify what's going to be useful not only to deal with the threat, but what's going to be strategically viable long term that is both that sets the right precedent and sets the right tone for where we want to be in cyberspace writ large.
Gary, and then I guess we'll conclude with Lauren, even though I said we were going to start with her.
Well, that's fine. Listen, there's a lot of good points raised. I think at the end of the day, it's not an either or. We all recognize that there's a role to play. It's just a matter of how much emphasis is placed on using the military capability as part of a broader solution set. And I think conversations that sort of push in the direction of, that itself is a non-starter. Don't grapple fully with the fact that this is a national security problem broadly, and the agility that is brought to the table and the ability to disrupt is an important component of dealing with a national security problem, and that's what the department is built to be able to do.
Yeah, echoing, the panelists in this whole conversation, right? Like this, exactly. It's a national security issue. This is really impacting our way of life. It's impacting our well-being, our security. And so we need, a way to impose costs and, even deter these actors. So I think that's incredibly important, to state up front, and just want to advocate again from previous experience, just doing it in a way that, is strategic, is in line or, with, or brings the force structure in line with the ability to do this, because I think we're in this moment where it's happening all around us. It's this ambient conflict, but we don't know how long it's going to last, right? Is it going to be a couple of years? Is it going to be 20 years? Is it going to be 100 years? So I think we really need to make sure that we are preparing to do this in a way that, marshals these resources and, we have a good strategy for doing it. Not to just be enmeshed in sort of tactical wins here and there.
Thanks, Lauren. So I think that's a great way to conclude the conversation, which is to say this is not the end of the conversation. So I think we'll certainly hope to carry this particular topic forward in perhaps future conversations or writings, and would invite others to join the conversation. And you've seen what's been written. If you have thoughts on this, I would encourage you, the audience, to jot them down as well. I want to thank our great panelists, including Dimitri. Sorry that he wasn't able to wage his bot army to further tip the scales on the poll, and say thanks for joining us, and we'll be in touch. So please also stay in touch.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Megan.
Thank you.
Thank you.